All right, so let's begin with the big talking points from this afternoon's budget. The Finance Minister tackling our energy crisis head on today in his budget speech. Our lack of reliable power supply is our single biggest economic constraint, he says. Let's take a closer look at the measures Enoch Godongwana laid out regarding supporting Eskom as it tries to get more power to the grid and help homes and businesses deal with the impact of the blackouts. I'm joined now by Professor Mark Swilling, energy and sustainability expert at Stellenbosch University. Prof, thank you so much for your time. Government moving 2/3 of Eskom's debt, a total debt relief of 254 million rand. It's broken up in different ways, but how exactly is that going to free Eskom up to deal with the business of getting more power to the grid, sorting out its coal mafia problem, so many issues that it faces?
254 billion. Yes, it's a lot of money. It's spread out over 3 years. You will recall that he did refer in his medium-term budget statement end of last year that National Treasury is looking at taking over some of the Eskom debt. But that has proved so complex and so technically difficult that it's going to cause huge amounts of delay. So what you're looking at now is capital injection, equity injections into Eskom, on condition Eskom spends that money to pay down its debt. And the money to pay for that is really going to come from increased borrowing by 2 to 3%, increase by 2 to 3%. So we're borrowing at sovereign rates, which is relatively cheap, and giving cash to Eskom in order to pay down its debt, which is probably higher than its sovereign rate. So that's the deal on the table. The conditions are, coming directly to your question, is that Eskom cannot actually spend any of that money on new generation capacity. It can only, it is only allowed to, is only authorized for capital expenditure on transmission and distribution. In other words, the grid. That's where Eskom is allowed to play. So I think this speech is significant. It's a defining moment because it effectively is a declaration that the future business of Eskom is not in generation. That's effectively what the speech has done.
So then the generation will be up to the existing coal-fired power stations, and then what the private sector brings online, the rooftop solar, etc.?
Yes. Yeah. So part of the conditions are that Eskom is allowed to spend a capex to fix what it can of the existing coal-fired power stations, but also to consider concessioning them off to the private sector. But the large bulk, it is very clear from the speech that the large bulk of new generation capacity is going to come from the private sector, as well as from businesses and households who have now been incentivized to rapidly install at their own cost with incentives and tax deductions large amounts of renewable energy capacity on our 12 million or so rooftops.
Prof, is this a good thing? Because I can hear the unions, already saying, privatising Eskom, it's all been a big plan to privatise Eskom. This is not the way to go. But I mean, we're privatising alternative power essentially. But do you think it's moving in the correct direction?
Well, it's a complex story. I mean, there are definitely going to be those who say, yeah, we told you so. They're selling off the family silver. This is all a plot by big capital in the private sector to really take over the energy system. And there are also going to be those who are going to complain that it's state-directed interference and interventionism in a more direct way in the running of Eskom, and that is going to actually make the problems worse. So those are going to be the two positions. We are in a crisis where the state needs to take leadership and guide without suppressing initiative. And I think what's starting to emerge in a kind of higgledy-piggledy way, not just in this budget, but with all the other pieces, is a framework where the state actually is guiding investment in new generation capacity, in the transmission grid, in distribution. And it really is now up to, it's a question of whether the kinds of relationships and understandings and trust is going to emerge that's going to result in increased capital flows into our energy sector in order to address our problems and our challenges. That's still to come. But what this budget speech basically puts in place is a wide range of incentives, including concessioning of sections of the transmission grid to private sector for fixed periods of time, like in the Northern Cape, to ensure that there is grid capacity to take on new generation capacity where there are excellent renewable resources.
You spoke a little earlier about a number of the conditions to this money that government is giving to Eskom to pay off its debts, essentially. The last condition is so interesting, is that Eskom must implement the recommendations from an independent assessment of its operations commissioned by Treasury. What is that all about? Particularly, I mean, we've just in the last hour interviewed one of our producers from Checkpoint, Sebe Buthelezi, who's gone into great depth to unpack and understand the coal mafias that are operating, just one of the many problems facing Eskom. But if there's going to be this Treasury probe of what's going on at Eskom, I mean, what could that uncover? What could be the purpose of that?
Well, the purpose of that is, I mean, there have been similar kinds of studies. So DPE has done them, Eskom has done them. There's been a lot of deep throat investigations into the Eskom power stations. But this is the first one by National Treasury. And I think National Treasury wanted an international team, partly to verify those reports, but also to do its own independent analysis in order to give it a kind of benchmark analysis of, how bad is the damage? What is it going to cost to really fix what can be fixed? What's beyond salvage? And on what basis does one get rid of or close down some of those irretrievable power stations, some of which are beyond their dead stop date anyway? So I think that's what, so say, National Treasury is actually building an instrument for itself in order to now manage the relationship with Eskom in order to implement these conditionality. It does mean Eskom is now in an incredibly complex situation. On the one hand, it falls under DPE. On the other hand, it's regulated by policy set by DMRE. Now there's a new Minister of Electricity, and now you have a shareholder who's becoming very interventionist with an instrument to guide its judgments on how Eskom should behave, which is the National Treasury. So this is getting very complex, and I don't envy the new CEO, whoever that's going to be.
Yeah, whoever they might be. And yes, of course, we're awaiting that cabinet reshuffle and that new electricity minister. If we take it down to the household level, to people watching this evening, households can now claim back from the 1st of March 25% of the cost of solar installation to a maximum cap of 15,000 Rand, which essentially means if you spend, say, 60,000 Rand as a maximum on installing solar panels, battery, inverter, you can then claim back a maximum of 15,000 Rand when you fill out your tax forms. That's my understanding anyway. How significant is this development? And can the solar market, which is already in huge demand, actually keep up with what's going to be surely a spike in demand?
Well, all the solar operators are saying they can't keep up with demand. So let's just make that clear, which is obviously also going to push up prices. But let's also be clear that this particular subsidy for private residential is just for the solar panel and doesn't cover any other aspects, the inverter and the batteries. And obviously that has got a specific intention, which is lots and lots of people have been putting batteries in without solar. And that actually places a huge burden on the grid, because as soon as load shedding is over, everyone charges their batteries. And that's adding at least a state to our problems. So it's an interesting incentive to say, okay, if you've got batteries, now go and buy some panels. And so you've already spent money on your inverter and your battery. You've already spent that money. So now go and spend some money on your panels, and you're going to get 15,000 back. And in that way, you're going to take load off the grid. It's not a bad idea, but 15,000 is not a lot of money.
You know, Mark, you're co-director of the Centre for Sustainable Transitions at Stellenbosch University. Looking big picture-wise, what you heard today, Is it laying the groundwork for a sustainable future of solid power provision?
You know, Sally, I've just finished writing a paper comparing energy transitions in India, the Netherlands, Germany, and South Africa, and more superficially, various other countries. And one thing is absolutely clear. These are loud, noisy, contradictory, explosive transition dynamics. And if you look back over the last 500 years, there's normally a revolution when there is an energy transition. So we cannot expect anything to be smooth. So I think what we heard today, as I've already said, a clear message is the future of Eskom is not in generation. Eskom as a generation company is basically history. It now has to move into the new era, which is about managing the grid and then buying and selling electricity within a new framework. And that lies at the very center of a new energy system. In my view, it should remain the grid should remain a public resource, and that transmission industry should remain publicly owned. But there are those who also want it to be privatized, and that might reinforce the energy inequalities that we have in South Africa. So I wouldn't go that route. But the answer to your question is yes. This is a decisive step forward for our transition, and not least because it's saying to businesses and households, you now have a role. Get out there, do what you need to do in order to make sure you look after your own energy needs, including poorer households.
Thank you so much for chatting to us. Such interesting insights there from Professor Mark Swilling, co-director of the Centre for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University, saying that Eskom really, this is the signal. It's moving into a new era away from a generation that, he believes, is now to be largely privatised.